Now let's take a look at plugins that deal with dynamics. And that means plugins that affect the dynamic range of a sound. Now these effects work kind of based on the relationship of a sound to a threshold. And a threshold is a certain level of volume that you set that once the sound interacts with it, the dynamics plugin is going to do something to that sound. And there's basically two kinds of effects in the dynamics processing world. There's those that care about any sound that goes above the threshold, and then there are those that care about what sounds don't make it up to the threshold or live below the threshold. So let's start by taking a look at those that care about the sounds that go above the threshold. And these are known as compressors or limiters. So a compressor and a limiter are kind of the same animal, they're just different degrees of effect. We'll start by kind of talking about the compressor and then show you that the limiter is really the same thing, just with one setting slightly different. So in this graph, I'm representing sounds. I have volume levels like in your meters. And I've set a threshold here, and I've decided that this is the threshold. So when a sound stays below that threshold, we're not going to have any effect. In all these little 2-bar graphs, I have the initial sound, and then this represents what's actually happening, what the compressor does to that sound. So if a sound doesn't hit the threshold, if it's not loud enough, it gets left alone and it sounds the way it sounds. If a sound goes beyond the threshold, then what the compressor does is it actually compresses that sound, the volume of that sound, back down. And it does it according to a ratio, which I've got up here. In this situation, we have a 1-to-1 ratio. So for every 1 dB, let's say these lines are different, 1 dB, 2 dB, 3 dB. For every 1 dB we go above the threshold, the compressor is going to turn that sound down by 1 dB. So we have a 1-to-1 ratio. In this instance, we have a 2-to-1. And our sound's gone above it 4 dB. And as a result, we're going to push that down 2. Which means for every 2 dB it goes above the threshold, push it down by 1. That's your 2-to-1 ratio. Now this is really helpful for keeping sounds, obviously, at a kind of consistent volume. Anything that goes above that threshold, we want to bring it kind of back closer to our threshold because that's the volume we want to keep things at. This is really useful if you're working on something like a voiceover where there's lots of loud transients, and you kind of want to make everything about the same volume so that when other people listen back to it, they don't have to strain to hear quiet parts and then there's loud parts. This is a way of kind of leveling things off. Now the limiter is basically the extreme version of that, and it does what it's called. It limits the sound. So when you set the threshold with a limiter, it doesn't matter how much louder that sound is than the threshold. You're always going to get that sound. Now this seems like, well, why wouldn't we always use that? But the problem is that the way dynamics work is that you're really turning down the volume. It's like if you could imagine sitting there and turning a volume knob really fast. You know what that sounds like. There's an unevenness, their volume changes, and to the human ear we can hear that. So a limiter actually, a lot of times when it's used, sounds kind of unnatural because we know that there's some forceful dynamic changes going on there. We use a compressor because it's a little bit more of a natural sounding effect, but you'll use both of them in audio quite a bit, and we'll show you a few examples and we'll show a couple examples in this movie. Next, let's look at an image for the expander or gate. And these are the dynamics plugins that are concerned about the sounds below the threshold. Again, we've got the same sort of setup, a threshold, volume, and sounds coming up, but this time we're interested in sounds below the threshold. Any sound that doesn't make it up to the threshold basically doesn't qualify. If you can't make it to the threshold, we don't care about you and we don't want to hear you. So we assign a ratio to turn things down that are below that threshold. So in this case, we've got a sound that's not quite loud enough. We've pushed that sound back down. Now this is useful if you have a track where someone's speaking, but in between when they're speaking, there's a little bit of background noise that's kind of quiet, but you wish it was a lot quieter. This can be useful in terms of when the person starts to speak. If we set the threshold so that their voice just breaks the threshold, we'll always hear them speak, but then when they're done, we'll have the volume of the rest of the background noise pushed back down. So it allows us to separate the volume difference between what we want to hear and what we don't want to hear. And a gate, kind of like the way the limiter is the extreme version of the compressor, the gate is kind of the extreme version of the expander. It's basically an open and shut deal. It's like a garage door. Either you can pull in or you can't. There's no, well, if you make it, we'll give you a little bit. We set the threshold, and any sound that doesn't make it over that threshold is squashed, and we don't hear it at all. So anything that doesn't make it up to our threshold, we never hear. And we'll show you an example of this. It's great for using this on things like drums or things where you want kind of a real fast open and close situation. I should also mention that we're looking at expanders as downward expanders, but there's also a way commonly to set an expander to work as an upward expander, in which sounds above the threshold are actually turned up, as opposed to turning down the quiet sounds and moving the noise down. We're taking what we want to hear, like the voiceover, and making it even louder. But generally, assuming that you've set your recording levels well and gotten a full signal, you'll probably be using a downward expander most of the time. Now let's go back into Pro Tools and open a few of these up and take a look at how they actually work with sound files.